What's up, everyone? This tutorial is going to be showing you how I approach mid-side. It's going to be more from a beginner level because I know a lot of you don't really understand it and are looking for a more beginner and introduction to what mid-side EQ and how, like, what it is and how I approach it. So if you already know what this is, you're welcome to follow along, but this is going to be more a novice level tutorial. So jumping in, what is mid-side? So mid-side is basically the relationship between the center, the mid frequencies. Now, I don't mean mid as in like in the middle of the frequency spectrum, you know, compared to highs and lows. When I say mid, I mean it's in the center of your head. Now, you should be listening in headphones for this tutorial because you'll be able to represent and hear the clarity on the mid versus the stereo much better. So basically, what happens is you have your mid signal and you have your stereo signal. And stereo basically means left versus right. So if I drop a serum into a channel, and we've just written this in F0 here. So it's just a note in F0, we have an initial patch. Just a saw wave. And we drop a span on the master. A Voxtango span, free plugin online. You'll see that this saw wave is fully mono. And the way that you set this up is you go next to the routing here, go the drop down arrow and go mid-side stereo and then select an underlay for the sides. So as we start adding stereo in Serum by duplicating the voices and pushing them left and right, we now get side information. So it's fully mono. Now we've added in another one and now we have pushed that saw wave. We pushed one to the left and one to the right. So now we're getting a lot of stereo information. So the stereo is represented by the yellow. The red is where the stereo actually overpowers the mid. Now, in general, when we're making music, it's good to work in the stereo field because we like width. Width sounds good. It makes things sound bigger. But what can happen is that we get phasing issues. Now, to give you a little rundown on how phasing works, if we put a sine wave, so we go basic shapes, we put a sine wave on oscillator A, and we go basic shapes, and we put a sine wave on oscillator B. Now what happens is these two oscillators, they start at the same point. So if I start both of them, because you can see the phase here, that's the starting point, that's where the wave starts. If we have one, we just have a sine wave. And if we add another that also starts at the same point, we double the amplitude or we double the volume. And what happens is this peak or this trough here, it stacks with this trough. So we have a trough and now we have a double trough. And this peak will stack with this one. So now that's double the size. So we get a doubling of the amplitude of the wave, which means that the volume increases. But what happens is if we push this out of phase by 180 degrees, so this starts all the way back here, because that trough will now be intercepting with this peak, and this peak will now be intercepting with that trough, we get what's called phase cancellation. Now I'm trying to play that. Nothing's coming out, because these two sine waves are 180 degrees out of phase. So there's a perfect phase cancellation. As we bring them back into phase, which means that by in phase, I mean they start at the same point, you'll hear the volume comes back. So it comes back more and more and more until we get to 180 and now it's doubled again. So you can imagine that if we duplicate the waves like that, so I'll go back to one sine wave. If we put the unison on, what we're doing is this number increasing is how many waves, how many copies of the wave are happening. So now we go from 1 to 2, we're duplicating the sine wave, pushing one to the left and one to the right. You can see it was in the center, now we got one to the left and one to the right. So now we have a lot of stereo information. These waves are interacting. And what happens is, you'll see that the volume's fluttering, and that's because they're going in and out of phase. And we don't want that, especially in our bass area. As you go further up sorry, I can't speak. As you go further up the frequency spectrum, having width and stuff is more acceptable, but as a rule of thumb, anything below 100 hertz, try and keep that fully free of stereo. So what we might do is, let's say we make like a pretty basic sound. So we're gonna put oscillator B on, put it 2 octaves and 7 semitones up, and turn the volume down on that. And we're gonna use that as an FM for oscillator A. So turn FM from B on. So we'll just modulate that with the LFO. So this sounds pretty cool, right? But it's very centered. So we're like, okay, let's put some unison on the carrier wave. Now, that's great. Sounds really cool. But, and this is the but, what happens is, when you play music on big club and festival systems, it's collapsed into mono, because a big system like that can't have stereo. If you imagine, it's one thing to listen to stereo in your headphones, where you have the right and the left ear, and you have stuff in the center, and you can hear where stuff is all placed. But if you try and play different signals, aka what stereo is, it's different signals coming into your left and your right ear, out of a massive festival system, the people who are closer to the left side of the stage would hear something completely different to the people on the right side of the stage. We can't have that. So they're collapsed into mono. And in Ableton, we can almost emulate what happens here by putting a utility on and hitting the mono button. So when I put it in mono, now you can really hear the effect of the phase. You can audibly hear that the volume is changing, and the reason is because the phase of these waves here that are interacting is going in and out. Now for a song, we really don't want this, because we don't want the volume to be fluttering all over the place, and we also don't want to lose power. We want it to sound nice and big. You can really hear that the sub is mainly being affected, but across the board it is. So what do? We want width, but we don't want to lose mono compatibility. So how we do this is, in Serum, the first thing you can do is that you put it onto an odd number, and we adjust the blend so that the mid signal is much more powerful than the side signal. Now this is going to do a little bit, but not a lot. And especially once you start applying stuff like distortion and compression, we start bringing up. The compression brings the lows up towards the highs. It compresses the sound together. Distortion pushes things up into a ceiling. And the difference between your mid and side here is going to become a lot less prominent. See, that's just not acceptable. So, what we can do is, we get an EQ8, we put that onto the channel, and we change the mode from stereo to mid-side. So we got our mid, and we got our side. So imagine the mid as just the green, which is in the middle, and the side is the yellow. And what we can do is we can EQ the side so that it is less than the mid. So the first thing we'll do is, so we switch to the side area. We turn on band 1, and we put this on a ×4, so a steep curve. And we're going to completely cut the sides below 100 hertz. And we're going to taper it off. So now what we've done is the sub bass is completely mono, which is what we want. It's a rule of thumb, we always want the sub bass to be completely mono. Another thing we can do is across the board, so we might get 6 here and change this to that sort of band or that sort of curve. Across the board, we can reduce the side information. Now what you see is that we're getting a much more healthy mid-side relationship here. The mids are always higher than the sides, We don't have too little of the sides, so there's still width and it sounds nice in stereo. But what happens now is if we listen to this in mono, we're getting less of an effect from the stereo field. It's causing less phasing. We can still hear it somewhat. But it's not as prominent. And essentially when you do mid-side, that's what you're looking to do. You chuck on, you usually use an EQ, so just a mid-side EQ, and you adjust the mid versus the side. Now another thing we can do here is we go to the mids, and across the board we can make it higher. So now what we're finding is that we're getting a boost in the mids and we're cutting the sides across the board, and we're also completely removing the sides below 100 Hertz. Now unfortunately, this is still causing phasing, even though it looks good on here. When we go back into Serum, we're getting phasing issues because we're getting a lot of interaction between the waves. So something you might do is you might completely make this mono, so there's no stereo, and we shape the sound like we want, so we get the distortion and the compression. And if we listen to this in mono, because the sound is completely mono, we'll get no phase interaction. And you can add the sides later with widening plugins. So I'm going to turn off this EQ. Now, one that I like to use is called Side Widener 2. It's by Joey Sturgis Tones, or JST. And this is a good one that has a lot of mono compatibility. There's a lot of different ways that you can get width, and I won't get into that now. You can use things like the Haas effect, H-A-A-S, but you can look up how to get width on your sounds on YouTube. But different methods of getting width, depending on the sound that you're widening with them, will have different retain different levels of mono compatibility. It also depends how much you're adding. So if I take this completely mono sound and I start adding width, so now we got width. I'll A/B that. But now what happens is when we go to the master, we're not getting any phasing because we've taken a mono sound and we've gotten it sitting where we want it, and then we've added the width later on. So that's just something to retain, that when you start using Unison, whether it be in Serum or whatever other synthesizer you're using, maybe it's Vital or something like that, the further or the earlier on that you add width, the more it's going to have an effect on your sound later down the track, and the more difficult it'll be to sort your sound out. But as a general rule of thumb, we always want to cut all the side information. So in this case, so I'm going to put this back onto stereo. So you can see the side widener plugin, it actually doesn't add a lot in the lows. And they've probably just built that in because they know that low sides are not good. But we still want to cut those. So we might boost the sides a lot. But now we're getting a lot of interference. So you can see that when the sides start to take over the mids, that's when we really get issues. We're getting a bigger reduction in volume there. So we might turn this EQ on, so we're boosting the mids, cutting the sides across the board, and removing the sides below 100. Now our sound is a bit healthier. So it's big and wide in the stereo. But we're not getting a big reduction in volume. Now this is the sort of sound that I would probably work with now, because now we have width, but when we go into mono, it still sounds powerful. So that's basically the way I approach mid-side EQ, and the way that you guys should start approaching mid-side EQ. It's, think about it in your synthesizer, but in general, we could also do this with any sound we get. So if I just type in bass, and I drop this bass in here, and we listen to this, so if we go onto the master, turn off the mono, turn on our span. Now this sound doesn't have a lot of sides in the lows, But you can see that further up, the sides are really like on par with or overpowering our mids. And if we turn on mono, we lose a lot of the clarity and character of the sound. So what we might do is we might take this sound and then again, drop an EQ8, put it on mid side, turn it onto your sides, completely cut the sides from the lows. I'll put on span so you can watch what I'm doing. And then across the board, we might do this with another one. Don't be afraid to use different EQs to do different things. So for this one, we still stay on the sides. Take band 6, whatever band you want, and then completely start reducing the sides. Now you see we have a healthier relationship. We have no sides in the lows, and across the board, the mids have a nice little boost over the sides. Now if we listen to this in mono. So AB staying in mono, but with and without the EQs. That's with, without. This is not as prominent. Again, it's hit and miss. Sometimes it can really affect the sound, sometimes it won't. But I definitely can hear it, and it also depends on where you are with your level of mixing and how tuned and trained your ears are. But I can definitely hear that the clarity of the main tone of the sound is sort of reduced. It's a bit more noisy and messy. But when we turn the mid-side EQ on, it's a bit more prominent. So that's basically how I approach mid-side EQ. Doesn't matter what sound it is, essentially it's the relationship between the volume of your mids against the volume of your sides at each different frequency range. But as a rule of thumb, reduce your sides completely, cut them below 100 Hertz. And then across the board, we want a nice healthy relationship between our mids and our sides. So we want to have as much width as we want, but we also want to keep that in check so that as much sides as we want, but we want to keep it in check so the mids is always sitting nicely there. I'll get into more of this in further videos, but for this one, just begin with that. I'll see you in the next video.